This event today has brought together business, education, civic, and other community leaders. Nearly 400 of you in attendance today at this event in Bloomington from every corner of the state. And that is very important as we learn about little-known information about early brain development, understanding the business case for investment in early childhood education, and ways to develop and sustain an early learning coalition in your individual communities, which again I think will be important for that momentum to continue.
Really think about somebody in your life who's struggling, somebody you know who's really struggling in one way or another. It usually comes down to one of these components. And then if you think of somebody who's really living their best life, whatever that would be for them, they're probably pretty good at executive function. So these are very, very important skills. The good news is it's never too late. We can always get better at them. As children grow older, this cognitive flexibility, working memory, focus, and inhibitory control actually lead into reflecting, analyzing, planning, and evaluating. Right? All of which we need to be really high-functioning adults and get our goals achieved and meet academic standards. Right? The way that the country has moving with the academic standards, you used to learn a lot of things, just a little bit about them. And now as we've revamped them, we're going deeper, crossing knowledge and applying it. And without executive function, it's going to be very, very difficult for our kids to meet the standards. So what this is an example of is how we need strategies to help employ our executive function for ourselves as adults, but also knowing our own strategies so we can promote it in children to see what they're doing. Executive function life skills are important in addressing high school success. Delayed gratification in preschool is a precursor of these skills years later, and I'll show you a little research when we get to focus and self-control about how important it is. Executive function life skills are important in addressing college success and the graduation rate. And this is a study by Tanji. Self-control predicts college students' grades, fewer impulse control problems, better adjustments, and better relationships. So the good news is we can promote these skills. One aspect of executive function skills in 4-year-olds is attention span persistence. Is strongly predictive whether or not these same children graduated from college when they were 25 years old. This is a study from Megan McLennan out of Oregon State University, who worked with us closely in Evansville on our study. And it was so significant that children who were rated 1 standard deviation higher on attention span persistent at age 4 had almost a 50%, so 48.7% greater odds of completing college at age 25. If we're going to make a difference in school readiness, school success, and workforce readiness, executive functions are a good place to intervene. They're not the silver bullet. You still need content, and you still need, the relationships and all of the other things. But this is one component of the way that we develop as humans that really can be honed in on to make a huge difference.
And we want to encourage you to engage in the discussion today, to make this an interactive, not a passive process, but an interactive process. So use the hashtag IN4, F-O-R, IN4 early. That's the hashtag. And, I always say if it's not on Twitter, it doesn't happen. So I'm going to take a picture. Everybody smile. Okay, very good. And I'll tweet that. I'll tweet that out this morning. And again, that hashtag is IN4early to post comments throughout the event today.
A lot of what you're going to hear today, in fact, you've already heard some of this, attempts to answer the question, why invest in early childhood education? Why? Why do we do this? Why early childhood investments help drive economic development? And maybe most importantly, why should I care about this for my community? A lot of times you will hear people say, well, this is the parent's job. This is the parent's job. And that is true. There are unique roles that only a parent can play in optimal early childhood experience. But many of Indiana parents are not home during the workday. By choice and/or by economic necessity, about 2/3 of children aged 0 to 5 live in households where all parents work. roughly 330,000 children statewide, their children need someplace to be. About a third of them, 130,000 of them, roughly, are in what we call known care, in a formal setting that is licensed by or registered in the state of Indiana. The rest, the other 200,000, are being cared for in an informal setting. This map shows how accessible formal care is by Indiana County. And again, I don't expect you to be able to read all that, so I'll color code here. The counties in red are counties which have less than 10 formal programs of any type. Of the 5,000 plus known care settings, only about 1,000 are what Indiana would consider to be high quality settings. Only about 1,000. Only 20% of the known providers offer what Indiana considers to be a high quality early childhood educational experience. The kind of high quality that increases the odds that kids will ultimately show up at the kindergarten door ready to learn. What Indiana needs is high quality settings, but they have to be high quality settings that are readily accessible by parents. What Indiana also needs, if we're stacking up all of the needs for the state, what Indiana also needs is for those high quality, accessible settings to also be affordable. In fact, this whole day has been built to keep sharing the why, the where, and the what of this all-important topic.
I want to emphasize there are a large number of things you can do to work on the quality of your local workforce. It's not just early childhood, but early childhood is something we know how to do, we know works. It works in affecting the local economy in two ways. One is by the children who are involved in these programs end up growing up and being more productive adults. And in fact, if you look at the data, Americans aren't as hypermobile as some people sometimes think. 60 to 70% of all Americans will spend most of their working career in the state in which they spent their early childhood. 40 in a metro area level, 40 to 50% of all Americans will spend most of their working career in the metro area where they spent their early childhood. Now, that means that though if Indiana invests in early childhood, some people, for some strange reason, will move to Michigan, which is where I'm from, or Ohio, or Washington, D.C., or Seattle. Most, in fact, will stay in Indiana. And there's such a large return to these investments that it pays off at the state and local level. In addition, there's a very great return to these programs from their effects on parents. The child care provided by these programs enables parents to work, enables them to go back to school. Both those things enhance skills, enhance long-term earnings, even after the free child care is over. So what you find is that per dollar invested in your state or local economy in these programs, you get a rate of return in the form of higher per capita earnings that has a present value. Present value is just an economic term of we have this stream of earnings returns over the next 40 or 50 years. We have to somehow convert them into today's dollars, and we discount them back to the present. And what we say is that the present value of all those returns discounted back to the when we invest, we get $5 to $9 for every dollar we put into them. One very interesting finding from numerous studies of early childhood programs, and this graph shows this, is fading followed by recovery. That is, it is very common that if you test kids at the end of the program or when they enter kindergarten, and you give them various literacy and math tests, and you ask yourself, based on studies of how test scores are correlated with adult earnings, what earnings effects would you predict based on those entering kindergarten test scores? So you can do that, and you come up with numbers for these different programs. And then you go along and you test the kids around 3rd grade. What do you find? You almost always find some fading, sometimes 50%, sometimes 70%, sometimes 90%. And by fading, I mean that if you take the 3rd grade test scores, the differential between the treatment and control group, you would predict much lower effects on adult earnings. And in fact, the Perry preschool looked like a total failure at the 3rd grade follow-up. You would have predicted this is a worthless program. We stuck all this money into these kids. We did 2 years of preschool, small class size, trained teachers. Failure, 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 failure. Yet, years later, this huge effect on earnings. Some people might say, why should I put my tax dollars to helping other people's children? What's in it for me? Well, there are several things that are in it for you. So let's talk about enlightened self-interest. I'm an economist, so I'm very comfortable talking about self-interest. And what's in it for me? Well, you might care about it. Even if you think your kid's fine with your resources and your parenting and whatever preschool you can afford to put them in, you might be concerned about peer effects in school, which are there, and every parent knows it, and the research supports the fact there are peer effects. You might want the other kids to maybe have fewer issues so that the teacher can spend more time with your kid, right? So that's one thing. We also know there are going to be fiscal effects. There are going to be effects on crime later on. The judge mentioned that earlier. You might not want to be mugged by one of those other people's kids you didn't want to invest in. There's also fiscal effects. Some of them are immediate, like lower special ed cost. Others are long-term, lower prison cost, higher tax revenue, lower welfare. Basically, the studies suggest, you can do different studies, high-quality preschool, high-quality early childhood programs probably reach the fiscal break-even point after somewhere between 10 and 25 years. What I want to stress actually today is more the economic spillover effect. Okay, this is a chart based on various studies, and this Jeff kind of got to this earlier on. There are huge spillover effects of skills in the labor market. So there are a number of studies showing that your wage rate, what you are paid, depends not only on your education level, but on the average education level of the local labor market you live in. So that's interesting. And in fact, the effects are so strong that if we look at the effect of increasing college graduation rates, that these spillover effects appear to be greater than the direct effects. So what this chart says is, what if we take 1% of the population, and we increase the college graduation rate by 1% of the overall population? So for that 1%, it raises earnings by 80%. What does that do to overall average earnings? Well, we divide 80% by 100. It raises overall average earnings by 0.8%. What do we actually observe, though? We observe in local labor market data that when we raise the percentage of the local population that has a college degree by 1%, earnings actually goes up by 1.9%. There's a 0.8% direct effect. There is a 1.1% spillover effect. Now, obviously, the people who gain the most are the ones who get the college education, but there is a general increase in average real wages when we increase skills. The economy is not a zero-sum game where we're all competing for a fixed number of jobs. It's a positive-sum game in which we're trying to grow the overall pie, and part of that occurs through us interacting with each other through the skills we have or don't have. But if the programs are high quality, they can pay off not just for the nation, which is what Heckman and people like that are trying to address, but for a state or local economy. In my view, if you're going to try to change the politics of this, one of the keys is enlisting the business community. Now, why is that? Well, because if all you're talking to is the early child educators, the K-12 people, the social workers, and with all, and the so-called usual suspects, that's simply not a sufficient political coalition to pass these things. I mean, in order for this to occur, it has to be something that when the Indiana business community goes to the legislature and says, here are the key items on our agenda for this legislative session, that significant investments in early child education are among the key items they're listing.
Clearly, Indiana has a great opportunity to make a difference in our economy and communities by investing in our youngest Hoosiers.